Hello, my name is Dan Curry. I'm a Centerville native. I grew up here in the Centerville community. And I cannot think of any place better to have grown up than right here in beautiful Centerville, Georgia. When you say community, it truly is a community. It's like a community on steroids, where in many ways we're just like family. In many cases, we are family. This is Centerville, as I knew it. I was born June 24, 1949. When I look at the highway, this is Highway 124. It is paved, and it's my understanding that I was 2 years old when this road was paved. So it has to be somewhere around 1951 or beyond. When I look at the house to the right, extreme right, the house where you see the window there, that house moved. It was moved about a quarter of a mile north of here around 1956. It was my first year in school. I was in first grade, the school year 1955, 1956. So somewhere during that year it was moved. So this place is this picture being taken early to mid 50s. If you look at the cars, you'll see there's some 40s or 50s. I think you may see one in another picture that might go up to about 54, 55. So this is about the time frame this picture was taken. Now, if you can envision where the camera person was standing to their rear, and of course out of view of the camera, Colbert Brannan's store. Now that we'll see in another photo, but another building directly across the street to the right of the camera person. Never been able to find a picture of this, but this is an old building that was built, I think probably in the 40s. I think it was built for a gentleman to build a trailer or something to use as a camper when he went to Florida. But in later years, it was a salvage store. We affectionately call that a jot 'em down store. These guys would buy railroad salvage or truck line salvage and then sell it at a reduced price. Also, this was Douglas White's auto shop. Now, when you look down, the big house on the left-hand side, that's Jimmy Garner and Cammie Garner. His wife's name was Cammie Garner's home. Now, Jimmy Garner, he ran the store that was across the street from the house there for a while, and he also ran the bigger store, which is on the right-hand side. We'll see that again in another picture, but Mr. Garner, he was a businessman. He also had a sawmill. I'm not sure if that was just for his own personal use or maybe cut wood, some for others as well. But I want to remind you, this intersection right here, of course, is the intersection of Highway 124. And then, of course, Annistown Road intersects to the right. Rosebud Road connects to the left. And, of course, it's a little bit off of this. It's not a direct intersection. You'll see it improved a little bit over the period of time. But back again to that small store that on the left-hand side, the field behind that store is currently where Publix is today. Another house that's out of view, the first house beyond that store, it was built by Evelyn and J.T. Jordan. And to my knowledge, that would be the first brick house built in the Centerville area. In the next 8 to 10 years, other brick houses were built, but I think that may have been the first. The next building you see is what we call the teacherage. And I'm going to talk about the teacherage when we look at another picture in just a moment. But we have the teacherage, then Rockbridge Baptist Church, and then the gymnasium, and then Centerville Elementary School. Here in this photo, we see a front portion of Rockbridge Baptist Church. This front building was built in 1879. Prior to that, this church was constituted August 16, 1819, on the banks of the Yellow River near a rock bridge formation that crossed the river. Hence the name Rock Bridge. Also, Rock Bridge Road got its name down there as well, too. But it was there from 1819 up until 1879. They acquired a deed, I think, in the early part of 1879, erected the building and moved in that fall. There's a Sunday school T on the back of it, which was built around 1945, 1946. The next building you see there is the Centerville Elementary School Gymnasium. And of course, this is after a couple of expansions, a little bit to the front and a little bit to the side, putting in some more distinct bleachers for the interior. The initial building was built largely in part by folks from the community, giving trees, having timber cut for the purpose of building this building. And then, of course, we have Centerville Elementary School. Today, Hope and Life Fellowship sits on this location. Rockbridge Baptist Church still continues. The name changed back in 2001 to Hope and Life Fellowship. Under Rockbridge Baptist Church in 1983, this is Hope and Life Fellowship now. They're at the intersection of Highway 124 and Campbell Road. Okay, the teacher is to the left. Now, there has been an office and also a carport that's been added. This was built around 1945, 1946 as a duplex. It was built by the community. The community raised money for this and put a lot of work in it themselves. I know a lot of the men, my father being one of them, drove a car, I think it was a 1940 Ford, all over North Georgia selling raffle tickets. And the proceeds of that went towards the construction of this building. Another project that the ladies did, the Ladies Sewing Club, they quilted a quilt and raffled it off. As a matter of fact, one of our residents, Floyd Johnson, he was the one that won this quilt. And currently today, his youngest daughter, Lorraine Davis, has this quilt. Lorraine also has a second quilt, one that the ladies came together, quilted a quilt, raffled it off, raising money for a lady in the community to have surgery. Now, this was a great community project. But the teacherage was built as a duplex. You see, back in the day when a teacher would come to the area to teach, oftentimes they would have to board with someone. They didn't live in the area. They might come from North Georgia or South Georgia, somewhere near the Alabama line, wherever. But they would come here and they would board, live with these folks during the school year and taught school here at Centerville Elementary School. So this was built to help that. And this remained as a duplex up until the early 60s when Jim and Elizabeth Crowley came in with their two sons. And this became just a one-family dwelling, and it will stay that way pretty much through to the end. When the school shut down in the late 60s, facets in the community were the two churches. We had Zora United Methodist Church in Rockbridge, and the Board of Education gave equal shares, one half to Rockbridge, one half to Zora, and then Rockbridge bought Zora out. I think it was somewhat less than $5,000 what they paid for the Zora half of this building. You see the church, Rockbridge Baptist Church, as I said earlier, this was erected in 1879. You see the Sunday school wing there on the back. That's a T. That was built in the mid-40s, 45, 46. If you look beyond that, you'll see the construction of Publix, and that tells me that this picture was taken about 1996. This is the Centerville Elementary School. You can see the gymnasium over to the left-hand side. You see all the kids at play. This obviously is recess. The girls oftentimes played up in the very front yard, whereas in the very back of the building, there was a place there that the guys played softball, or oftentimes we would just team up and just chase one another and just play dog pile, and we'd pile 8 or 10 people on top of one person. Here we see a festival, I think what probably was occurring here in September of every year. The Gwinnett County Fair would come to town, and there would be a parade around the old, which is now we call it the historic courthouse. Back then it was the active courthouse in the county, but there would be a parade there in the city of Lawrenceville that would kick off the fair being opened. And it looks like that float was connected to a tractor, which tells me this was the float that was in a parade there in Lawrenceville kicking off a fair. Probably was in the 50s, maybe early 60s when this occurred. I took this picture. I'm standing there on the edge of Centerville Rosebud Road. Of course, these roads now are paved. The store building, when I was a child, oftentimes it was just remain closed, and from time to time it would be opened up and maybe be a little grocery store, another little salvage store like we talked about earlier, a jot 'em down store. And then in later years, Robert Landers had a battery store in there, and he was a chief supplier of batteries for Puckett Brothers Manufacturing Company. Let me back up on Puckett Brothers just a moment. When I spoke earlier about Highway 124 and it being paved, there was a footnote that I failed to mention. Richard Puckett drove the water truck when they paved Highway 124, let's say around 1951. Richard Puckett, he and his brother Otis were the founders of Puckett Brothers Paving, and then later Puckett Brothers Manufacturing Company, wherein they developed motor graders and small paving equipment and all for the asphalt construction industry. But Robert Landers supplied a lot of batteries for them right out of that building right there. And then in later years, Benny and Ronald Ford had a used car lot there, and later it became Neighbors' used car lot. And this, I believe, might have been Neighbors on the day this picture here was taken. Now, this is the right-hand side of Highway 124. We talked about the left-hand side. Now we're back to the right-hand side of the 124. Now, again, just envision the camera person on the day this was taken standing probably on the property line between Colbert Brannon's store and Lavinda Juhan's store. Colbert's store will be to the back of the camera person, of course, out of view. We'll see it at another angle here in just a few moments. But if you look to the right, we see what was called the old mill house. It was a grist mill. My understanding is back before electricity came in Centerville, this was driven by a mule. They attached a mule to this device and it walked around in circles and it ground the seed into meal. Later, when electricity came into the area back in the 1940s, it was hooked up to electricity and became an electric grist mill. Let's talk about electricity just for a moment. When you looked at the very first picture we had, you saw the power lines along the road. And we said this was somewhere in the early to mid 50s when this picture was taken. Electricity came into this area somewhere in the early to mid 40s. So you got to bear in mind that how the area had changed when this picture was taken. Let's say 8 to 10 years before this picture was taken, all the roads were dirt and there was no electricity. So in just a short period of time, a lot of change had begun with the paving of the road, with the electricity coming in. Prior to electricity, people lighted their homes with kerosene lamps, coal heaters, wood stoves, wood fireplaces. So life changed considerably. But this grist mill, interesting note about this, my father cut hair. He's a country barber, part-time barber, on the upper floor of this building, and he cut for 10 cents a head. My friend Wayne Mason always talks about when he was a little boy, my father had him sit on a nail keg. My dad cut his hair for 10 cents a head. Also, at that upper level, the Woodmen of the World Fraternity Lodge was also housed up there as well. The next building down, with the cars parked out in front, that at that time was Lavinda and Elsie Juhan's store. And, of course, this is current day U.S. Auto. Of course, over the years, it changed proprietorship. It was Lavinda Juhan back in this era. Somewhere in the late 60s, I guess, mid-60s, a gentleman by the name of Grady Spivey bought it from Lavinda Juhan. He ran it for a few years, and another gentleman by the name of Bob Crow, he and his family bought it. They ran it for a number of years, and then it was sold to Frankie Hewitt. Frankie still owns the property, and he has leased it to U.S. Auto. If you look across the street, the house I referenced earlier as being one that was moved, it was moved about a quarter of a mile up the road to what is now the entrance to Imperial Village subdivision. But over a period of time, after this house was moved out, a nice brick ranch house was built, probably occupied about 1958, 1959. It stayed occupied for a number of years, and then it was moved out. Property sat vacant for a number of years. Then a service station, a convenience store that is, was built on this corner, and it occupied that for several years, and then that was torn down, and now present-day Walgreens is there. So in my span of life, I have seen the property set vacant, and I have seen 4 different entities on that piece of property. Now, back in the 40s, before I was born, where that White House is, Hubert Brannon, that was his home, he and his wife, and my father worked for him. He didn't have a regular job, but he was recuperating from a fall that he had sustained while working for the federal government. And he built screen doors. And Hubert Brannon would sell those screen doors for people to put on their doors. And that was sort of the modern day air conditioning. Prior to that, people just had open windows, open doors, bugs, flies, all kind of insects go in and out. But now people were moving up to having screens on their windows and doors. I also want to mention the very first picture we looked at, we talked about Mr. Jimmy Garner's house. That is the present day QT. Is on that location. Now this is Centerville from a different angle. This is shooting from down the hill, up the hill a ways. This picture I took back in 1984. And if you look up at the very top of the hill, look at the very far distance away, you see the very top of J.W. Darby's house. J.W. and Mildred Darby lived in that house. It was a little over 100 years old when it was torn down in the early 2000s. The store, the one that Colbert Brannon ran, he had various people to run it for from time to time back in the very early days, early 1950s, about the time the pictures we first looked at were made. A gentleman by the name of Claude Jones was running this store. I think there may have been a partnership actually between he and Colbert, and then 2 or 3 other people ran this store for Colbert, and then later Colbert himself ran this store. Colbert was quite a businessman, quite a character, but really a great friend. The yellow house, we talked earlier about the grist mill. It was remodeled. Lavinda Juhan had this building remodeled, took off the second level, made a nice little one-story dwelling house, and his mother lived in this house for a number of years until she passed away. Lavender and Elsie lived in a small apartment at the very back of the store. And then, of course, the bigger store here where you see the gas pumps and the truck out front. This is current day U.S. Auto. And, of course, this intersection is very much different today than it was back on this day in 1984. All right, this is Zoar United Methodist Church. Zoar United Methodist Church was established back in 1811. It's actually older than Rockbridge Baptist Church. This, of course, is an older picture of Zoar, probably taken in the 1950s. It looks from the picture that the basement has been dug out. They jacked the building up at one time back in the late 40s, early 50s, dug out a nice basement for Sunday school rooms. So I think the basement appears to be underneath there, but the addition is not on there. It definitely came later. Zoar moved to Centerville from Everson Road somewhere about the same time that Rockbridge did, somewhere in the 1860s, 1870s. As we look here, this shows a view from Highway 124 across Floyd Johnson's hayfield pasture. You see the Zoar United Methodist Church. The steeple here has been added. The addition to the sanctuary is on the very back. You can see that. You can see the Sunday school annex off to the right-hand side. If you were standing in that same spot today, or similar to that, you would be standing in front of Wendy's. You'd be looking across Wendy's parking lot and across the building, actually, of the post office. And, of course, the Advance Auto would be a little bit to the right, and Walmart would be to the left and behind this hayfield. This, of course, is a more recent picture of Zoar. Very beautiful building. You see the steeple. And, of course, again, you can see the sanctuary had been expanded. This occurred in the 1970s. This is Floyd Johnson's hayfield, taken on the same day as that other picture we saw down at the far end. This would be before the Advance Auto and before Wendy's and before the post office. That White House at the very end down there between the trees, that was my parents' home, and that's where I grew up. Now we're talking about some of the people in the Centerville area. This is Miss Mary Freeman's Sunday school class. This, I believe, will be a primary Sunday school class. You see me, I'm second to the left over there, smiling away. This is a great group of small children from Rockbridge Church. This is Centerville Elementary School, Mrs. Crowley's 6th and 7th grade class, 1959-1960. You got to remember, Centerville Elementary School, the era that I grew up, first grade was by itself. Second and third grade were in the same room. You had one teacher, two classes. Second, third grade were together. Fourth and fifth grade were in the same class together. Sixth and seventh grade were in the same class together. And then finally, eighth grade was by itself. So this is two classes you're looking at here. Centerville Elementary School choral group, Mrs. Crowley's choral group, 1959-1960. If you notice, I'm not in there. I'm not much of a singer. This is Centerville Elementary School, grade 8, 1960-1961. You see my wife, Nancy, first row, sitting down, extreme left. This is the basketball team from Centerville in the late 30s. You've got the girls as well as the boys there together. I think principal and possibly the coach, Bice, is extreme right-hand side. Upper row, left-hand side, that's Tink Mitchell. This was Centerville's best at that time, probably around 1938, 1939. This is a little bit later, 1959, 1960, Centerville Elementary School coach Jim Crowley, who was also the principal of the school, and girls basketball team. This is a community Christmas play. Not exactly sure what time frame or what year this was taken. Probably in the 40s. We see such people in there as Robert and Dot Piper. We see Bill Mitchell and his wife Lily. We see Mrs. Floyd Johnson in the picture. We see Mr. Floyd Johnson in the picture as well as numerous other people. Centerville is a very strong community. This was a community Christmas pageant. This is what we call the Tom Thumb Wedding. It's actually not a wedding. It's a school play, a school pageant. Multiple classes involved with this. Again, you can see me in this picture. I'm the one on the right-hand side. You got the two girls, and then myself. I got that gray-black jacket on. That is me. I think I may be looking at the girls in that picture. This was taken somewhere around 1956. This, I often call this the beginning of the Republican Party here in Gwinnett County. We see a couple of our ladies here. This was a newspaper clipping, Gwinnett Republican women at the Lawrenceville headquarters. Very much in the center is Sarah Johnson, Mrs. Walter Johnson. She was a beautician here in Centerville. She was the mother of Jerry Johnson, and she was a very strong Republican. This was back in the day when most everyone was Democrats, but this was the beginning. To the right, you see Mrs. Mary Freeman. She was the one also had her picture taken with the Sunday school class back in one of the first shots of the people of Centerville. And then if you look to the left and standing, you see Mrs. Lillian Webb, who later became mayor of Norcross and then later became chairperson of the Gwinnett County Commission. I think she may have been the first female chairperson of the Gwinnett County Commission, along with a couple of other ladies, Mrs. Gustafson and Mrs. Combs. But this was pretty much the beginning of the Republican Party. This was taken about 1964, I believe, here in Gwinnett County. Earlier, I mentioned that my father was a country barber. This is my dad. He's cutting Arthur Darby's hair. Arthur, at this time, was a retired farmer and retired blacksmith shop operator. He had a blacksmith shop there in his yard. My dad was cutting his hair. Now, I said earlier that back in the 40s, he charged 10 cents a head. I'm sure he had gone up considerably. I think at this time, this would be in the 70s, he was probably charging Arthur 75 cents for a haircut. My dad started when he was a teenager, and he also loved animals. Being at our house was kind of like a zoo. We had all kind of animals. If it was different, that's what he wanted. Different types of cats and dogs, and there's always people coming to our house either to get a haircut or to see the animals. So that's my dad and Arthur Darby. This is Doc Mitchell's family, and this is his father and mother and some of his siblings. This is William Mitchell and his wife Emma. This is the Mitchell family home, and got a couple of their mules out there along with the children. This is Doc Mitchell, his wife Zelma, and their firstborn son Horace Mitchell. This is Doc at an older age, visiting some friends there in the Centerville area, Doc Mitchell. Colbert Brannon. This is Colbert and his wife, and of course their 5 children. To the left there we got Billy, and then next to Colbert there is Shirley, and then Bobby, and then right in front of Colbert is Peggy, and then Mike. Mike and I, we were about the same age. I think I might be about 6 weeks or so older than Mike. We went all the way through school. Started day 1 and graduated high school at South Gwinnett in 1967 together. Mike passed a few years ago with ALS. This, of course, is another very prominent family who lived here in the area. This is the Wendell Cofer family. Wendell was the postman here in the Centerville area. This is he and his wife Tommy. There are 3 sons. You've got the older one there kind of standing in the middle. That is Bob. And then you have got Jim. Jim recently published a book called 200 Years of History of Snellville. It was premiered back in April of this year. Did a fantastic job. It's currently being reprinted. And then, of course, their youngest son, Frankie. An interesting story about how things operated back in the day. I know about a mile from where we lived, there was an older couple, and the gentleman had, I forget what his disease was. He was bedridden for quite some while, and of course the wife didn't drive. So if she needed groceries or something from the store, she'd just put a note out in the mailbox. Wendell Cofer, he would pick it up, and of course it would be the note would just, have my father's name on it. And then, 15 minutes later, that note would arrive in our mailbox. And then that evening when Father came in from work, he would take the note, look at it, read it, go down to the store, buy whatever she needed, and deliver it out to their house. And here again, that's the way community worked back in the day. We took care of one another. I mentioned that you would see Tink Mitchell again. This is Tink. I think at this time this was his girlfriend, Marie Freeman, who later became Marie Mitchell. They have 2 children, Linda Edson now, and also Benny as their son. And this was taken somewhere around 1938, 1939 when they were dating, when they were courting. I believe he is the youngest of Doc Mitchell's children. This is my parents. This is Homer and Thelma Curry. This was taken about 1990. This is my wife's parents. This is Fred and Ophelia Campbell, again taken about 1990. I mentioned earlier that we would see Mr. Jimmy Garner again. This is Jimmy Garner's sawmill. And as I stated earlier, obviously he's cutting wood. I don't know if it's just for private consumption or if he sold it, but there he is. Obviously just stopped working at the sawmill to pose for a picture. The Campbell family. Campbell family had a lot of children, had a lot of influence here in this area. This is Billy and Shady Campbell. This is Billy and Shady Campbell's 5 sons. I refer to this as being the 5 judges. You've got to the very left is John Campbell, who is my wife's grandfather. Interesting character. John was the justice of the peace here in the area, which meant that oftentimes if somebody wanted to get married, rather than go and get a preacher and go into the church, they'd just go to Mr. and Miss Campbell's house and say, hey, we've come to be married. And right there on the front porch or maybe in their front living room, that couple could be married. Also, he could write a warrant. He did a lot of things. Also, about once a month, there was a little community courthouse that stood at that time back behind where U.S. Auto stands today. It's just right there on the very edge of the road, but he would conduct what I would call debtor's court, and he didn't have a gavel, but he would take his pocket knife and he would wrap it into session, and also I'm sure use it to adjourn, but he'd listen to the cases and then they would make some determination as to how the person would handle his debt. Here we have 4 of their sisters. Of course, the very 5th one out there, the extreme right, is a sister-in-law. This, I believe, is at a Campbell reunion over in Briscoe Park. Some houses here in the Centerville area. This is the home of Mr. Walter Watson. Beautiful home. It's set directly across the street from where Zaxby's is today. Beautiful, stately home. This is the Doc Mitchell home. Sits out on Annistown Road. This is the Hugh Baker house. This stands behind where the Verizon store is currently, and then across the parking lot from Publix. So it's a little bit behind Publix as well too, on Centerville Rosebud Road. This house was torn down a few years ago. Eva Knight's house. Her husband, Noom, and they owned this house, raised their family there. This house was taken out several years ago to make way for Walgreens to come in and several other businesses along that strip. But this is the Noom and Eva Knight's home. The Floyd Johnson home. Years ago, this house was owned by Dr. Brown, who lived in the house, and then I think around 1940, Floyd and Kate Johnson purchased this house. Beautiful home here on Highway 124. It too was taken out somewhere about 2004 or 5. This is a picture of the Mink Livesey house over on Mink Livesey Road. This house is similar in nature to the Jimmy Garner house that we saw in the very first picture. This house most recently been known as the Thomas Livesey house. It was the Thomas McGuire house. It was there where Thomas McGuire ran his 900-acre plantation. This house has recently been purchased by Gwinnett County and will be set aside as a historic landmark here in the county. But Thomas McGuire had his plantation there, and you can read excerpts from his farm journal. But Margaret Mitchell visited this house, and it's thought that this could be the house that gave her the thought of Tara in her book Gone with the Wind. Now, the next house you'll see is the Anderson home, and this possibly give Margaret Mitchell the idea of 12 Oaks for Gone with the Wind. Some very prominent homes here in the Centerville area. Okay, one landmark here in Centerville, or just right outside of Centerville over on Yellow River, is the Annistown River Bridge. Of course, I grew up traveling over this one-lane bridge, and this shows the construction, which we can only imagine. This is somewhere back in the 1930s, but you see men hanging off the girders and off the steel frame of the bridge as it's being constructed. This is Mr. Bond. He is the contractor who built this. I'm sure before this it was just a wooden bridge that crossed the river, and this gave way to a much better means of transportation to get people back and forth. A great way to go to Atlanta, or a shortcut, depending on what the road conditions were at that time. This is a little different view of Annistown Bridge during construction. You see men up on top, or actually on top of the floor area. This is a picture of Annistown Bridge taken in the winter of 1961. You see the old stake body truck coming down the other side of the hill there, the other side of the bridge, and everything's covered in snow. And then our last picture of Annistown Bridge was taken around 2000. At this time, the road was already closed off. The a newer bridge. It was obviously taking the traffic at that time, but this is just a good Christmas postcard picture of the bridge covered in ice. Beautiful bridge. Of course, sometime after this, the bridge was actually torn down. Just want to give a special thanks to Lee over at the Centerville Library for the fine work that she has done, helping us with the history of Centerville for the last 20, maybe 21 months. She pulled us together back in January of last year, and we pulled in this team of folks who were enthusiastic about preserving and just actually finding and then preserving the history of Centerville. And I want to thank that team and for all that they have done and all that we've hopefully accomplished in the last year and a half. And Lee, you've done a fantastic job, and we thank you for that. We thank the Centerville Library as a whole.